Well, we'd like to thank everyone for attending Dr. Potenza's talk today. The International Center for Youth Gambling Problems and High-Risk Behaviors at McGill, in collaboration with the National Council on Problem Gambling, is pleased to present the first of 4 webinars by leading international scholars in the field of gambling studies and behavioral addictions. The series, which we titled Gambling During a Digital Revolution, will focus on how technology has impacted gambling and gaming, as well as gamblers and their families. We would like to thank the Raschkowan family for their generous donation to the International Center for Youth Gambling Problems, which has made this series and lectures possible. We hope you will find these webinars informative and help advance your research and clinical practice. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Potenza, who's the author of over 1,000 peer-reviewed publications, book chapters, and books. Dr. Potenza is an internationally distinguished and award-winning clinical researcher and psychiatrist. He's the director of Yale Center of Excellence in Gambling Research, the director for the Women and Addictions Core of Women's Health Research at Yale, and professor of psychiatry, neuroscience, and child study at Yale University School of Medicine. It's a great pleasure to have Mark kick off this lecture series, and the title of his talk, which you see in front of you, is Gambling and Gaming Disorders, a 2020 View of Clinical Considerations. Thanks again, Mark, for agreeing to participate.
Oh, thank you, Jeff, for the kind introduction and for giving me the opportunity to share this information with people. As I do with all of my talks these days, I have a listing of disclosures with respect to pharmaceutical, gambling, gaming, and legal entities. And I thought I'd start at the beginning of this century about how the field has been changing over the past 20 years. So in 2001, in the journal Science, Constance Holden authored an article asking whether behavioral addictions existed and whether we could use new technologies like brain imaging to look for similarities across certain behaviors like gambling and substance use behaviors. And in the setting, going from the time of publication of that article to the end of that decade, there was discussion about this notion from multiple perspectives. And there were similarities that were noted in many domains: clinical, phenomenological, epidemiological, that prompted pathological gambling, at the time was the name of the disorder, to be reconsidered going into DSM-5 and be considered as a behavioral addiction. So DSM-5, along with the ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases, both underwent revisions during the past decade. DSM-5 in 2013, ICD-11 from 2018 to 2019. And what was happening at the time with respect to DSM-5 was that there were several controversial disorders, and in this Time magazine article a year before DSM-5 was released, several of those were discussed as the new abnormal. And internet addiction was one of the topics covered, and I'll talk about that with respect to gambling and gaming later in the presentation. So gambling disorder, though, was not amongst those listed as a controversial topic, largely because gambling disorder or pathological gambling was included going back to 1980 when it was introduced into DSM-3. Over the past decades, over the past 40 years, there have been multiple changes to the inclusionary criteria, but probably one of the biggest changes going from DSM-4 to DSM-5 was the reclassification of pathological gambling as instead of as an impulse control disorder, rather as an addictive disorder. And in doing so, there was also the renaming of the condition, dropping pathological and renaming it more neutrally as gambling disorder, given concerns about potential stigma related to the name pathological gambling. And one can ask whether it matters as to how a condition is classified. And I would argue that it does, as some jurisdictions, like in France, the government requires addiction treatment centers to provide care for people with all sorts of addictions. So having a condition classified as an addiction may have important clinical implications, including with respect to who gets treatment. And I think it's obvious to many people that the internet has changed people's lives in substantial ways. And there are many behaviors in which one can engage on the internet. And in this setting, there have been concerns raised about how much time people are spending in front of screens and what they're doing in front of screens. And if excessive engagement or interfering levels of engagement of internet use may be considered as an addiction, as a compulsion, or disorder. And in the setting of this environment, DSM-5, the work group that focused on substance use disorders, considered both gambling disorder and what they termed internet gaming disorder. An internet gaming disorder was placed into Section 3 as a provisional diagnosis requiring further research. And these discussions largely occurred about a decade ago. And more recently, more data have been obtained and considered by groups like the World Health Organization in anticipation of the 11th revision of the ICD. So going back about 15 years ago, we began collecting data on high school students and internet use behaviors, adapting the Minnesota Impulsive Disorders interview for internet use and for gaming. And we used a relatively stringent threshold to define problematic internet use, that one needed to acknowledge an irresistible urge that could only be fulfilled by using the internet, a growing tension or anxiety prior to wanting to use the internet, and then having tried to cut back on internet use. And what we found was that about 4% of the high school students acknowledged all three questions. Boys spent more time on the internet, but girls were more likely to think that they had a problem with internet use. And this is similar to what we've seen in a gender-related manner with gambling behaviors. And that certain subgroups of individuals were more likely to meet the criteria for problematic internet use, particularly individuals of Asian and Hispanic backgrounds. And problematic internet use was associated with a number of negative health measures, including substance use, depression, and aggression. We also independently, as I mentioned, adapted those questions to look at gaming behaviors. And what we found was that boys were more likely to report video gaming than were girls. Gaming was not linked to negative health measures in boys. It was actually linked to lower odds of smoking. But among girls, gaming was linked to depression, aggressive behaviors, and amongst the individuals who reported gaming, about 5% reported problematic gaming, again, meeting all three of those questions. And this proportion was higher among boys as compared to girls. And what we found across the gender groups was that the correlates of problematic gaming included regular tobacco use, drug use, depression, and getting into serious fights. So more recently, groups have considered a wider range of internet use behaviors that may be problematic. And data from Germany suggested 3 groups, including a gaming group, a social networking group, and an other group that may include pornography viewing or shopping or other behaviors. There were some gender-related differences, so social networking problems were predominantly reported by women, and gaming and other types of problems were predominantly reported by men. And we recently completed a meta-analysis that supported this finding these gender-related differences globally across multiple jurisdictions. And in this study from Germany, they reported that the psychological characteristics were largely similar across the 3 groups, which suggests that there may be some common vulnerability factors leading to problematic engagement in different types of internet use. Now, how has the internet affected gambling? Online gambling or internet gambling has essentially the market has essentially tripled in terms of dollars over the past decade or so. We also asked about internet gambling in our high school study and found that individuals who reported gambling on the internet were more likely to report problems with gambling, that poor academic performance and heavy alcohol use were more strongly associated with gambling problems amongst the internet group. But I think perhaps most importantly or telling was that gambling with friends was less strongly associated with gambling problems among the internet gambling group, suggesting that the youth who may develop problems with internet gambling may do so in a more isolated way, and this in some ways is different from some other risk behaviors of youth that in which peer involvement may be more substantial. Now, over the past 5+ years, the boundaries between gambling and gaming have become more blurred. And this can be seen in multiple domains, including daily fantasy sports, which are not legally defined as gambling, but contain gambling-related elements. And the internet may provide access to specific types of gambling, like sports gambling, and certain types of wagering, such as live action betting, may be particularly concerning and linked to problems. Now, the online sports betting market over the prior decade, again, largely tripled in size. And daily fantasy sports have grown substantially. And these are data from March of last year showing that a majority of the states in the United States had access to daily fantasy sports. And when the Supreme Court declared that the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act was unconstitutional, that allowed states to apply for or engage in online in sports betting. And many states have introduced legislation or legalized legislation to allow for sports betting. And again, this is from about a year ago. And the operators of daily fantasy sports sites are in a particularly good position to integrate gaming and gambling within this domain. The media has also, I think, changed over the past several years with sports programs more fully integrating betting lines and programs on gambling into their repertoire. And organizations like the NCAA have been concerned about the potential impact on student athletes and others with respect to changes in sports wagering and gaming. So some of the additional blurred boundaries between gambling and gaming include social casino games, microtransactions where one may pay to continue to game, and this has been linked to online gambling initiation and participation. Also, competitive gaming or esports may involve wagering, both actual gambling and so-called skin gambling, where people may be wagering on virtual things, such as decorations for guns that may carry monetary value outside of the virtual domain. And loot boxes or loot crates are another area that people have debated as to whether these constitute gambling. In some jurisdictions like Belgium have made them illegal, and in the United States there's been states that have proposed laws to try to limit loot boxes and loot crates. Also, the content of some online games like Grand Theft Auto Online, the Diamond Casino and Resort include elements of gambling and violence amongst other factors. And this, the inclusion of gambling content into the game has led some jurisdictions to block access to this version of Grand Theft Auto, and this has raised some debate within the gaming community. And this link with weapons and mass violence is something that's been debated for gaming and may also hold for gambling. There have been several high-profile incidents that have involved people who were gamers or gamblers shooting individuals. And so we were interested in understanding these relationships amongst adolescents. And we went back to our high school data and found that weapon carrying was associated with more permissive gambling attitudes, perceived parental permissiveness towards gambling, more family gambling concerns, at-risk problematic gambling, and relatively diminished associations between at-risk problematic gambling and gambling with peers and family members and adults. And these findings together suggest that more socially isolated gambling may link at-risk problem gambling and weapon carrying. And we found similar relationships with gaming, particularly among youth with high sensation seeking. And so these findings taken together suggest that isolative and sensation-seeking youth may be particularly vulnerable to these relationships between gaming, gambling, and weapon carrying. So esports has become a growing phenomenon, and particularly during COVID-19, it's one of the safer sporting events that can be held. But even before that, arenas would fill with tens of thousands of people, and more people would watch online, such that viewership of some of the major gaming events eclipsed the viewership of the Super Bowl or NBA Finals. The Olympics has considered whether to take up esports. And major sporting leagues like the NBA have gaming leagues that include top players who are obtained in drafts, and you can follow the gaming news like you can other sporting events by going into, for example, ESPN and going to the esports tab. And there are also other ways to follow gaming, such as platforms like Twitch. From a neuroscientific perspective, there are similarities and differences across substance use and addictive disorders at clinical and biological levels. One of these is with respect to blunting of reward-related processes, which we have found in individuals with at-risk or problematic internet use on EEG. This has also been seen during fMRI, particularly during the anticipation phase of reward processing, where a meta-analysis found that blunted activation of the ventral striatum was seen across addictive disorders, including substance use and gambling disorders. And we have found something similar with respect to internet gaming disorder. And so we have proposed models based on these similarities with gambling and substance use disorders for internet gaming disorder. And groups have modified approaches like behavioral therapies, like cognitive behavioral therapy, for internet and computer gaming disorders. And so a question for an earlier part of this decade was how the ICD-11 would respond with respect to either harmonizing or not with DSM-5 decisions with respect to gambling and gaming. And so in anticipation of the ICD-11, there were 5 work group meetings that have been conducted from 2014 to 2019, organized with the World Health Organization. And these meetings have focused on internet use and behavioral addictions. There have also been debates on gaming disorder, with some groups believing that gaming disorder should not be a formal diagnostic condition, and others believing that it should be. And the popular press has also seen debate on this topic, with articles on back-to-back days describing game addict disorder as being a moral panic, and others, another announcing that the National Health Services was opening an addiction clinic for individuals with online gaming problems. And this is also seen in other aspects of the press, where youth may get into oppositional behaviors that parents may have difficulties with. This is just one example of that. And so in this setting, we thought it would be important to further advocate that there is a need from a clinical and public health perspective to have gaming disorder in the ICD-11. When it was announced that it was being considered for inclusion in the ICD-11, the set of gaming groups, gaming industry groups, wrote and published an opposition, if you will, letter to gaming disorder being included in ICD-11. And we published back this letter in addiction that included over 120 authors in the Gaming Industry Response Consortium listing, questioning whether this was a corporate strategy to disregard harm and deflect social responsibility. And such behaviors have been seen at times historically, for example, in the early to mid 90s, when the tobacco industry representatives went in front of Congress and testified that they did not think that tobacco was addictive. So how did the ICD-11 consider all of this? So the World Health Assembly in May of 2019 adopted the ICD-11, and gambling and gaming disorders were included as disorders due to addictive behaviors, and entities for hazardous gambling and gaming were also included. And so the section entitled Disorders Due to Addictive Behaviors included a subsection, disorders due, this was a subsection under the disorders due to substance use or addictive behaviors. And so the consideration of both gambling and gaming behaviors as potentially addictive resonated with the decisions in DSM-5. Gambling disorder replaced pathological gambling in ICD-11, as was the case in DSM-5. But the specifiers for gambling disorder differed, with predominantly offline and predominantly online being included. And also the exclusion criteria for hazardous gambling or betting was different, and slightly different for bipolar disorder, in that it was in ICD-11, this is a strict exclusion criteria, whereas in DSM-5, it is not. It's just that it's not better accounted for by bipolar symptomatology. So the core features of gambling disorder are listed here, that there is a persistent or recurrent gambling behavior in which the individual demonstrates impaired control, gives increasing priority to the gambling, such that it takes precedence over other life interests and daily activities, and that there's a continuation despite negative consequences. Also importantly, there is significant impairment in one or more important areas of functioning, and the duration of 12 months is needed for diagnosis, although the required duration may be shortened if all diagnostic requirements are met and symptoms are severe. Hazardous gambling or betting, which is an exclusionary criteria, is a subsyndromal, if you will, level of gambling that increases the risk of harmful physical or mental health consequences and relates to the frequency of gambling or betting, the time spent, neglect of other activities and priorities, risky behaviors related to the gambling and betting, and adverse consequences. And this may be continued in spite of awareness to these risks. Similar, there are criteria for hazardous gaming. And importantly, the two entities for hazardous gambling and gambling disorder are exclusionary for one another. So this less severe pattern may be used to help identify at-risk groups or in determining public health impacts of subsyndromal, subdiagnostic levels of gambling related harms or problems. And as I mentioned, there's a similar category for gaming, and we contributed a case report about this, where there was a death of a veteran at a hospital while a nurse's aide was video gaming. So COVID-19 has had a significant impact on 2020, and so considering online behaviors during COVID-19 is important. Gaming has increased during COVID-19, in some cases with 70 or 75% increases. There have also been increases in viewership on platforms like Twitch. And health organizations like the WHO have promoted statements that suggest that gaming may increase socializing and reduce stress. And then a subsequent statement about mental health concerns recommended balanced gaming. So this is to consider. And we don't know what the shorter or longer term impacts of increased gaming might be, particularly given all of the concerns right now about disruptions in school and work and structured versus unstructured time, and the extent to which behavioral patterns may become instantiated and difficult to alter over time. So all of this warrants additional study. Gambling has also changed during the COVID-19 pandemic. With all the stress, personal, financial, that many people are seeing, this may promote gambling, as has been seen in prior financial crises. That gambling may also decrease during COVID-19, relating to closures of land-based casinos or cessation of sporting events. In this setting, though, there have been increases in gambling on amateur sporting events and other forms of online gambling may be increasing, particularly online casino gambling, which has been linked to high indebtedness and gambling problems. In a preliminary report of individuals in treatment for gambling problems, there have been significant anxiety and depression reported, with a small group reporting worsening of their gambling as well. So in this setting, we've also been working with a cost group on, and this is a European funding mechanism, the cost mechanism, on problematic internet use. And we generated a guidance on problematic internet use during the COVID-19 pandemic. There were general recommendations with respect to daily routines, getting healthy levels of sleep, exercise, fluids, personal care, and how to maintain social activities and contact while staying spatially distant. And there were also some specific internet-related recommendations with respect to self-monitoring and regulating screen time, monitoring children's behaviors, consider using digital well-being apps, as well as considering the use of analog technical tools as compared to digital, so that one is not perhaps tempted to check certain information or websites when one wants to, for example, know what time it is. In this setting, we also believe that the funding mechanisms or structure may need to be reconsidered given changes, technological changes, and behavioral addiction changes, where, for example, in the United States, there are programs or parts of the National Institutes on Health that focus on drug abuse and alcohol abuse and alcoholism, but not anyone that focuses on behavioral addictions. And this may lead to less research support for these important conditions. Specifically, we note that government support for gambling disorder appears lacking with respect to treatment resources. So in 2016, $73 million or 23 cents per capita was invested in gambling disorder treatment services from public funds. And this contrasts with the $24.4 billion invested in substance use disorder treatment services. Furthermore, the US government receives considerable gambling revenues, with state revenues estimated at over 27 billion in 2015. So we hope that government agencies will support research not only into gambling disorder, but into behavioral addictions more broadly. And so in summary, DSM-5 and ICD-11 have either considered or reconsidered gambling and gaming disorders, as well as hazardous gambling and hazardous gaming. I would note that gambling and gaming behaviors have been converging in multiple ways, and COVID-19 has impacted these behaviors, as well as others that are conducted on the internet. And additional research is needed to understand the health impacts of gambling and gaming in the current environment, the currently changing environment, so that we can use this information to prevent harms and promote health. I'd like to thank a large number of individuals, some of whom are listed here, as well as funding agencies, and I would be happy to take any questions. Thank you for your attention.
Well, Mark, thank you again for participating and for an excellent presentation and overview. And we're all concerned about the convergence between gambling and gaming, especially during this heightened period where we're now moving into what often is referred to as a new normal. So if there are any questions, can you please send them forward to Shamita and we can ask those of Mark. Mark, I guess I can ask a question while others are thinking about questions. Are there any cultural groups or any countries in which gaming and or gambling is particularly problematic?
Yeah, I would say that gaming and gambling are worldwide phenomena. And for example, prevalence estimates of gambling disorder have been largely similar across jurisdictions. With gaming disorder, uh, again, a worldwide phenomenon that the internet, I think, has eroded some geographic barriers. I would say that gaming disorder has been addressed more substantially in some jurisdictions, more so than in others. I think, for example, in the United States, it's perhaps not considered as much of a concern as, say, for example, in some Asian jurisdictions. Um, for example, South Korea has had a major public health effort targeting gaming behaviors and gaming disorder. They have also experienced some deaths in internet cafes related to gaming that may have prompted more aggressive public health policies, including changes in how the internet cafes are regulated.
Another question that was sent regarding treatment for, I guess, both gaming and gambling. Gambling, there's much more widespread treatment available, but a lot of parents of children and adolescents who have gaming problems continuously call our center and say, where can I get help for my child or my teenager who seems to be having a gaming disorder?
Yeah, I think that that's an excellent question. And so the gambling disorder field is a much more mature field, if you will, with respect to empirically tested evidence-based approaches. So treatment of gambling disorder has largely been behavioral therapies or psychotherapies as a mainstay. So there are strong data to support cognitive behavioral therapy in particular, but also some other forms of behavioral therapies, including motivational interviewing and brief interventions, have also received support. 12-step programs like Gamblers Anonymous also appear to be helpful for many people, and in conjunction with professional therapies seems to increase the likelihood of better outcomes. With gaming disorder, there are relatively few empirically validated treatment approaches. The one that I had in the talk by Klaus Wolfling, the CBT study, is one that was published in JAMA Psychiatry last year and showed efficacy of cognitive behavioral therapy for gaming disorder, like for gambling disorder. The other forms of treatments are still being tested largely, and there are relatively few centers or programs that specialize in helping individuals, including youth and their parents, often how to help people with gaming problems. That being said, different organizations and agencies that have been training individuals in counseling for gambling disorder are becoming increasingly involved in training individuals to help people with gaming disorder. So I think that will change over time. But given the support or lack of support that many jurisdictions have for behavioral addictions, it's unclear how rapidly that will change. So it's I'm hopeful, but there's been some slowness in the process.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. I do know that GameQuitters.com has tried to address some of these issues directly for parents, and that Cam Adair and Dan King are actually starting to look at some of the competencies necessary for training of professionals. One of the other questions asked was whether or not this webinar has been taped, and the answer is yes, and will be on the youth gambling website, www.youthgambling.com website, as soon as we have an opportunity to post that. So for those of you who would like to look at this presentation, or if you have colleagues who may want to also see and weren't able to do so, we've had a tremendous amount of inquiry from overseas where the time change has not been very advantageous to them. So one of the reasons, and we're grateful that Dr. Potenza has also agreed to have this webinar taped. And so we now have that. Do you think, Mark, do you think there's going to be a need for some specialty training in gaming disorder? I know that Cam Adair they're trying to come up with a certificate for training of people in gaming disorder.
I think that would be helpful in order to train people to provide evidence-based interventions. I also think that we need to build the evidence base for interventions. Some of the interventions that have been used historically, such as boot camps in Asia, have had limited support. So I think we need to work concurrently on both fronts in terms of doing the research to understand what works for people and to get more people in the clinical domain knowledgeable about people with these concerns. I think considering these within a developmental framework will also be important because gaming often begins during childhood and adolescence and young adults, and some young adults who are staying with their parents often may develop problems with gaming, and this may lead to family strain and other discord that may be best addressed in family therapy settings, and those should be investigated as well.
Marco, another question, and given what's happened during the pandemic and kids have been home virtually, certainly in North America since March of 2020, so they've been home almost as much as they've been in school during 2020. And many of the parents were working from home or are still working from home, have young children, and the easiest way to keep them occupied is to allow them to game. And given the fact that much of the gaming industry is now being done online on smartphones, many of these young people who have been virtually isolated have been able to either communicate, as you suggested in your presentation, or have actually played gaming or have gamed excessively with parents saying, I can't control this and work at the same time, so go ahead and game. now that many school jurisdictions are now reopening for the academic school year. Do you foresee this as a huge problem going forward? And are there any recommendations you can give parents?
Yeah, I think that in many ways, this is a big social experiment. We don't know what is going to happen with COVID-19, whether there will be further spikes in different jurisdictions and what that's going to do with respect to impacting schooling further. But yes, as I mentioned, we don't know how much flexibility there will be going from one set of structured slash unstructured setting with respect to time and demand on children to another one. And I think we should be cautious about that and try to, in as best ways as possible, to find ways to have individuals engage in healthy rather than unhealthy patterns of internet use. And so some of that is setting limits on behaviors, including gaming behaviors. Some of that will impact, for some people, abilities to do work and do work remotely. So the impact of COVID-19 on different groups has varied, I think, substantially. And some of that does relate to whether people have children or not, the extent to which people can get work done remotely or not. So there are many individual factors that are important to consider with respect to COVID-19. I would guide people to the consensus guidance that I mentioned in the talk with respect to internet use more generally, and to some of the WHO statements and guidances about gaming that they mentioned, particularly the mental health aspects of gaming. But a lot of this, we should be mindful that COVID-19 has been stressful for many people and stressful in different ways for different people. And so getting people the help that they may need from a mental health perspective, I think, is also important.
Great. We have a question that asks, are we moving away from using the word problem versus hazardous, either for gambling or gaming?
Yeah, so the terminology, I think, may vary, and it may refer to different aspects. So when going back to the mid 2000s, 2005, for example, when we were collecting data on gaming and internet use, these were not formal disorders. And some people had used the term internet addiction, and people had debated the extent to which these behaviors represent addictions or not. And given the limited amount of data, we thought that using the term problem was going to be less controversial and would cover the domain appropriately. With the term hazardous, I think that is a term that has specific meaning within the ICD-11 context, where they define hazardous gaming and hazardous gambling in a specific way, just as gambling disorder and gaming disorder, they are defined in specific ways. So I think that the terminologies can all be used, and they may refer to different aspects of behaviors.
There's a question that says, my son seems to be engaging in online gambling and exhibits some of the related addictive behaviors which you discussed. What action should I take as a parent?
Yeah, I think that some of that may depend upon the level of concern of the behaviors. It may depend on the age of the individual, whether this is an adult or a child, and I think where the person is located, in what jurisdiction. So in the United States, there is the National Council on Problem Gambling, and there are state affiliate councils. So I'm in Connecticut, so there's a Connecticut Council on Problem Gambling, and there are helplines that people can call to either seek help or to get into treatment. And I would encourage talking with such a resource and to get appropriate help and guidance from a counselor in order to get the most appropriate information.
Mark, there another question. Are you familiar with any research which has looked at changes in gambling patterns during COVID-19, such that obviously sports wagering was not really possible on professional or even collegiate sports during this time. But are you aware of any other shifts in online gambling to specific forms of online gambling, whether it be casino type games, lotteries?
Yes, so the paper that I mentioned and one of the references in that paper described some of the changes that have been occurring at least during the early part of the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of the changes are in line with what the person asking the question was mentioning. So yes, sporting events have been canceled. Land-based casinos have closed. Online gambling still continues. One can, there have been some reports of increases in amateur sports gambling, some of which has continued. I would not be surprised if some of the sports that may continue, both online and offline sports, may be a source for gambling. And by online, things like esports is what comes to mind. And there have been reports of increases in online casino gambling, and I think people are still collecting data, including, for example, in the Barcelona treatment center at Bellvitge Hospital, they are collecting data from people with gambling problems to monitor how they're doing during the COVID-19 pandemic. So more information will be coming.
Another question, given your extensive work with the World Health Organization on gaming, are there any problems concerning the differences of opinion that seem to have emanated during COVID-19, where they first encouraged people to game as a way of self-isolation and then kind of moderated that by saying this should be done in moderation?
I think that those statements, the first statement that encouraged gaming to reduce stress and to maintain social contact was shortly followed by the mental health statement about making sure to have a balance so that gaming problems are not an outcome. While the two are not mutually exclusive, I think the clarification in the second statement is very helpful so that it doesn't get misinterpreted. So that's how I read the statement.
Are there any primary risk factors for the development of a gaming disorder that you can share with the people who are in attendance today?
I think that there have been relatively few longitudinal studies that have looked at potential risk factors. There have been more in gambling disorder than in gaming disorder. But some of the risk factors that have come out of longitudinal studies, for example, in South Korea, is that um, some features like attention deficit hyperactivity symptoms, as well as depression, may lead to problems with gaming. But in some analyses, gaming may also lead to concerns with depression, for example. So I think we need to understand better these relationships and what may be preceding and what may be a consequence of. In the gambling field, data, for example, from the National Comorbidity Replication Study, which included, I believe, over 8,000 adults in the United States, it was estimated that in 3/4 of instances, a mental health disorder preceded the development of a gambling disorder. Mental health disorders, non-gambling mental health disorders, and gambling disorder frequently co-occur. And similar concerns have been noted for similar relationships have been noted for gaming disorder, particularly with depression. So I think these are features to keep in mind and to consider when identifying potentially at-risk youth.
Well, Mark, again, as we close, I want to thank you so much for your insightful presentation on both gambling and gaming. I want to thank the Raschkowan family for their donation to the center to help enable this series to go on. And want to thank again Shushmita and the Keith White and the National Council for Problem Gambling for helping host this series. Just as a reminder to everyone, our next presenter in the series will be another Mark, this time Dr. Mark Griffiths from Nottingham Trent University. And that will be on October 13th at noon. And we welcome everyone to pre-register. We will send everyone a note about registration going forward so that people can actually register as well. On Mark's slide, it indicates his email address. So if you have any further questions you'd like to directly address to Dr. Potenza, I'm sure he'd be more than happy to respond and send you to the appropriate references. As I mentioned earlier in my introduction, Mark has written over 1,000 papers and book chapters. So there's a lot of information that Mark can actually forward to everyone. Once again, I want to thank everyone for their attendance today, and I wish you all well, and everyone should stay safe. Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you, Jeff. Be well.